To start out the school year, you really just need to know some basic U.S. geography. It's the very first thing we're going to learn and the very first thing you'll be quizzed on. And to start out with, you just need to know the 50 states. You've probably done this in elementary school, probably in 7th and or 8th grade. So this is really where you get started with geography, is knowing the layout of the modern United States. Then we kind of rewind for a second and learn some of the physical features that helped develop the United States the way it has developed historically. And then we will move into like colonial regions and why those colonial regions developed the way they did. To help you remember the 50 states, you will receive in class, and or you can print off of the website, a copy of a blank map of the United States. This will just be a good tool. You can replay this video, show yourself the filled in version, practice without looking at the screen for a blank version. I'm really not going to go over the 50 states with you. It's something you're really just going to need to practice on your own. Now, if you look at a satellite image of the United States, North America really, but the United States is much of North America, you will see many, many features that will be pointed out throughout the course. You can then use another map that I will give you in class. I'll actually make them front to back so you'll have them on the same sheet of paper. Is a physical features map that you can then label. I am going to use the satellite image, however, to label some of the most important features. Now, one of the very first things, if I go chronologically, that happens in, I shouldn't even say U.S. history yet because it's still just North America, or the New World as it's known in the colonial era. One of the first things that happens is you have Christopher Columbus coming to the New World in 1492. So I will throw down that date on the screen, and I will also draw an arrow because he had nothing to do with North America. He actually found quite a few of the Caribbean islands, one called Hispaniola, and Hispaniola is today Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So Columbus comes in 1492. He's sent back on numerous expeditions. We will actually do an activity in class about Columbus and how the history of Columbus is really actually false. But for now, you just need to know that geographically, Columbus is only really coming and seeing the Caribbean. In 1609, so I'll put down another date, in 1609, you have settlers from Britain coming and settling Jamestown in Virginia. And that's down here in this region. And the history of Jamestown is something we can discuss further in class as well. A society that really failed to start with until tobacco was begun to be grown in Virginia. Prior to that, it was a failure and quite possibly could have led to these British settlers deciding to leave instead of sticking it out. Next up, in 1613, the Dutch set up, today it's known as New York because eventually it's controlled by the British and renamed. But in 1613, the Dutch settle New Amsterdam. And it is purely for trade. They really only want to participate in the fur trade with the Iroquois. And it's their only real goal. Eventually the British and the French force them out of North America, and they give up their land holdings ultimately to the British. Next up comes Plymouth in 1620. This is where the Pilgrims are well known. Again, we will discuss a lot of this history in class, and we will do activities on each of these labels. But for now, you're really just looking to get your map labeled. After all of these areas are gradually settled, and it's more than just an individual town, village, city, whatever you want to call it, and it's a full-blown colony, really what limited Western settlement, and you can see here, these lines right here and right here are the Appalachian Mountains. And I'm going to very intentionally label 1763 as the Appalachian Mountains. And the reason that I do that is because it is throughout the colonial period up to and including the French and Indian War that the Appalachian Mountains is really what limits Western settlement. So that's a very important question for the Regents exam. What limited Western settlement during the colonial period? And the answer is the Appalachian Mountains. So make sure that you have that labeled. After we fight the revolution, again, this is all stuff that we're going to go over in different sets of notes and different activities. Right now I just want you to get the visual of the physical features. One of the next features that is extremely important is that after the fighting of the Revolutionary War, the British give up essentially what is the Ohio River Valley to the colonists and say, that is yours. So all this here would be considered the Ohio River Valley, and what becomes the western border of the United States at that point, and you can kind of see where I'm following along a very specific line, and that specific line that you can see from space is the Mississippi River. And this becomes the western border of the United States in 1783 after we fight the Revolutionary War with the British. Now, I'm going to pause here real quick to point out that this here is all you need to know for the history at the beginning of the school year. Pretty much the entire first marking period you are going to spend learning about early American history, the early republic, and the writing of the Constitution. And so geographically, from day one right now until the end of the first marking period, these are all the physical features that you're going to need to probably use in your writing for homeworks, etc. There are other physical features, however, that I want you to know for your map quiz or geography quiz. And so I'm going to keep going. And the next one that I will point out is when we bought the Louisiana Territory. And that pretty much connects the Mississippi River that we just went over to the Rocky Mountains. So I am going to label the Rocky Mountain Range and the outer edge of our border limits at that point 1803. So in 1803 is when Thomas Jefferson sent a delegation to France, and really all he wanted to offer was the port of New Orleans. Right here, he wanted to offer up to $10 million to purchase the port of New Orleans from the French. Napoleon needed the money to fight his Napoleonic Wars in Europe. So he was more than willing to offer all of the Louisiana Territory, the whole thing, for $15 million. Now, there's not mass communication, there's not even telegraphs or anything like that in this time period, so the delegation kind of had to make an executive decision without Thomas Jefferson even being part of the conversation. Long story short, we did end up getting the Louisiana Territory. It doubled the size of the United States at the time, and it made the western border of the United States the Rocky Mountains. Texas declares independence from Mexico. Now, I'm going to use what is, for the most part, the modern borders of Texas, this area here. Up here is where it gets a little fishy. But this, I'm going to label 1836, because the Lone Star Republic, it wasn't even part of the United States for a while. From 1836, actually until about 1846, was the Lone Star Republic, And there's another river. Would be the Rio Grande right here. That would be what we believe the western border of the United States to be. Right here is what the Mexicans believed was the western border of the United States. So I'm going to kind of highlight this disputed territory. So for 10 years, from 1836 to 1846, and I'm going to put a question mark next to that date and an arrow over from 1836, and you can make any annotations on your map, jot any notes down that you may feel you need to remember this, but it's a 10-year period where Mexico and the United States, they disagree as to what the border is. And finally, the Mexican-American War is fought, and we not only gain what we thought was ours in the disputed territory, but we also gain pretty much from everything here to here, and all of this area in 1848 is the Mexican cession. It is what we gain from Mexico at the end of the Mexican War. At the same exact time this is happening, James K. Polk, president at the time, and we will go over him in detail when we get to that time period, was threatening the British over the Oregon Territory. And in 1846, again, same time as the Mexican-American War, the British give in and we divide the Oregon Territory. They keep the Canadian portions of the Oregon Territory. The United States keeps the what is the American section of Oregon. And so that's how we gain all of this territory. And one last purchase that we make to make up what is today the continental United States is in this area in 1853, and that's called the Gadsden Purchase. And the reason that we had bought it, if you look at the geography on this satellite image, a lot of mountains right here. It was a good place if we wanted to build a transcontinental railroad to kind of be able to go around some of the mountain ranges all the way to California. So this is what you will know eventually as your map of western expansion of the United States. Now, I hope that you've been writing a lot of this on your map. I hope that you've been taking notes off to the side. So this map that I made actually lays out a lot of what I just showed you, and certainly a lot more correct because I didn't have borders on my satellite image to show me the exact place for things. But it shows you Christopher Columbus over here. It shows you Jamestown, New Amsterdam, Plymouth, the Appalachian Mountains labeled for when they were the western limit of the United States. George Washington is a little cartoon. King George III is a little cartoon for that colonial period and revolutionary period. And then you have the Mississippi River right here that should be, and it's not on here, labeled 1783 as well. And then you have the Louisiana Purchase. You have Thomas Jefferson with his little cool side curls. You have Napoleon Bonaparte with his military hat and sword on, and they make a deal for us to have the Louisiana Purchase. You have the Lone Star Republic here that we gained portions of in 1836. From 1836 to 1846, here's the disputed territory. Then you have James K. Polk gaining the West from, in the case of Oregon, Britain, in the case of Mexico, the Mexican War, and then the Gadsden Purchase in 1853. And I have an arrow here and a railroad that really just looks like a creepy roller skate with smokestack coming out of it. I'm not a great artist, I apologize, but this is kind of like a cartoony, funny version of what you can use to remember some of these geographic features. So you can see the New England colonies, and they developed very specifically around their geographic features. You'll notice that here's a map of the entire modern United States. What is zoomed in here is also squared around, and the features that most impact the development of New England are the fact that everything is along the coast. You see the colorations here that Maine was actually a part of Massachusetts early on in the colonial period, and even after declaring independence and the United States becoming its own nation, Maine was still not its own state until 1820. But anyway, you can see the colorations here. Massachusetts Bay Colony would be Massachusetts and Maine. New Hampshire, here in green. Vermont, here in red, was actually claimed by both New Hampshire and by New York. Connecticut, here in this salmon color, and then Rhode Island here in blue. You can see Boston right here, which is not far away from Plymouth. And Boston was the single largest port in the colonial era. The British used Boston as a place to build many of their naval vessels. So I'm going to draw a little boat here. Forgive my artistic ability, or lack thereof, again. And the reason this develops is not only because the British need a strong navy, but also because people from Boston become traders. They sail around New England and even to other parts of the colonies, maybe all the way back to Britain, in fact, and trade what it is they are producing. In some cases, it's whaling and fishing out here on the Atlantic Ocean. Sometimes it's artisan crafts being created within Boston. And there's really not a ton of food coming out of New England. People do have their own family-sized gardens, but a lot of the food is being produced in the middle colonies, which New York was one, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. And the reason for that is that they had much better soil. New England had very rocky soil, so there's not going to be a whole lot of farming going on. And the development after that is much more of a shipbuilding and manufacturing. And when I say manufacturing, I do not mean full-blown factories. I mean artisans producing goods. It could be anything from a shoemaker, a candlesmith, a blacksmith, any trade that provided a service to somebody else. And then, of course, fish is going to be a major source of income, and whaling is going to be a major source of income. So the New England colonies develop, first and foremost, they're not going to be producing food. And then, because of their location on the coastline, this is going to be the important thing for a Regents exam question. On the coast leads them to shipbuilding, trading, artisans trading, and fishing and whaling. So that is really the development of the New England colonies that is extremely important for you to remember in this geography lesson. The middle colonies provided a lot of the foodstuffs and natural resources that the New England colonies could not provide. And they also provided much of this to the southern colonies because they're going to be doing a completely different type of farming. We'll get to that in a minute. But you can see the western boundary of the Appalachian Mountains. Here's the Adirondack Mountains and the Mohawk River Valley. So you have New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. And here in Vermont, modern Vermont, it's claimed by both New York and New Hampshire. Now, you can see by the colorations and by the pictures that the fur trade, and this really extended up into the Adirondack region, out into western New York, and we know this mainly just on New York history itself. Pennsylvania also had mountainous regions where lots of furs could be harvested. This was a very, very, very popular trade. You can see along the coast here where ships are being built, not only up here in Boston, but also here in New York, Philadelphia, which the Delaware River flows out into the Atlantic Ocean, and so that's where this ship would come into play. Iron, again, Pennsylvania, and specifically Pittsburgh and western Pennsylvania, becomes the steel industry much later in U.S. history. Why? Because there's a lot of iron ore in this region. You also have a lot of timber coming out of these mountainous regions. So, long story short, there is going to be foodstuff farming and natural resources coming out of the middle colonies, and that's really all they do for a living, is foodstuffs and, I'm going to abbreviate, natural resources. So foodstuffs and natural resources is really the extent of what the middle colonies are providing to the picture here. The last region that you see developing alongside the others is the southern colonies. And the southern colonies were exclusively, and I'm going to put this in all caps, they were cash crop producers. And that means early on tobacco, but eventually, especially after the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney, and we're going to learn about that again, especially cotton eventually. But in this early colonial period, it is mostly tobacco. So these are the two major cash crops. You also have things like rice and indigo, but much smaller scale than tobacco and cotton. And the reason for this is that in the South, you have a much warmer climate, which also means a much longer growing season. So, just to review, the New England colonies, all along the coast, with very rocky, not very fertile soil. So you will not see a ton of farming there. You will see much more of a shipbuilding, trading, fishing, and whaling. That is much of what's going to be going on in New England. The middle colonies are going to be much more of a foodstuffs and natural resources region. So timber, iron ore, food. Those are the types of things coming out of the middle colonies. And of course furs for profitability. And then in the South, it's all about profits, and that's why the nickname cash crop is given to tobacco and cotton. So early, it's tobacco. After the invention of the cotton gin in the early 1800s, you'll see an explosion of the production of cotton as well. But this is really all that I want you studying for your geography test that will be coming up soon. Thank you, and good luck studying.